Human beings are not afraid of losing things. They are afraid of losing things twice as much as they want to gain them. That is not a metaphor. That is not a proverb. That is a measurement taken in laboratories, replicated across cultures, confirmed in brain imaging studies, and quietly embedded in the architecture of every financial product you have ever owned, every subscription you have ever forgotten to cancel, every investment you have ever held too long, because selling it would make the loss real. The asymmetry is real. It is biological. It is ancient. And it is, at this precise moment in history, being used against you with a precision that would require a very long afternoon to fully describe. So let's begin. Here is the thing about a $5 loss. It doesn't cost you $5, it costs you something considerably more expensive. Because the part of your brain that processes the $5 loss is the same part that processes a broken bone, a social rejection, a predator in the tall grass. The loss registers as threat, not inconvenience, threat, and the machinery that responds to threat does not respond to reason, or to spreadsheets, or to the patient observation that $5 is, empirically $5. The machinery responds, and in responding it changes every decision you make afterward. This documentary is not about $5. It is about the engine behind the $5. The evolved mechanism that makes loss hurt twice as much as gain feels good, the institutions that have mapped that asymmetry with extraordinary care, and the deeply unsettling possibility that everything you think of as a free financial decision is, in fact, a predictable output of a system you have never been shown. The asymmetry has a name, it has a history, and it has, as we will discover, an agenda. I want to make you a promise that is not comfortable. By the end of this, you will understand something that cannot be unknown. You will see the mechanism operating in decisions you thought were yours. In the moment you held a losing stock instead of cutting it. In the moment you paid for the gym membership you never used because cancelling felt like admitting defeat. In the moment you took the guaranteed small win instead of the probable large one, because the small loss in the probable scenario was louder than the large gain. You will see it in the fine print of every subscription service, in the engineering of every casino floor, in the architecture of every political campaign that has ever told you what you stand to lose rather than what you stand to gain. You will see it in the way your employer frames your bonus, and in the way your real estate agent frames the asking price, and in the way your doctor presents your treatment options. The mechanism is everywhere. It has always been everywhere. The only thing that has changed is that the people who understand it most clearly are no longer using it merely to sell you things. They are using it to predict you, to model you, to move you, reliably and at scale, in directions that serve purposes other than yours. And the most uncomfortable part, the part that takes a moment to sit with, is this. Knowing about loss aversion does not protect you from loss aversion. This is not a documentary that ends with a 6-step solution, because the mechanism runs below awareness, and awareness, however sharp, is not the same as immunity. What I am offering is something more modest, and considerably more honest, a map, not an escape route, a map. Let us begin with the version of events that economics has been telling for 300 years. In this version, you are a rational actor. You enter every financial decision with a clear calculation of expected utility. You weigh probabilities, you assess outcomes, you make the choice that maximizes your gain relative to your cost. And if you don't, if you make what appears from the outside to be a suboptimal decision, it is because you lacked information or time or discipline or some other correctable deficiency. This version of events produced the efficient market hypothesis. It produced the capital asset pricing model. It produced an entire civilization of financial infrastructure built on the premise that markets aggregate rational individual preferences into efficient collective outcomes. It is a beautiful architecture, internally consistent, mathematically elegant, and it describes a creature that does not exist. The creature it describes makes no more sense than a version of gravity that works only when you're paying attention to it. Human beings are not rational actors who occasionally make emotional mistakes. They are emotional actors who occasionally make rational calculations. The direction of the default matters enormously, and economics for 3 centuries had it exactly backwards. It took 2 psychologists from Jerusalem, neither of whom had any formal training in economics, to notice what the economists had been averaging away for generations. What they noticed was this. When you ask people how much they would need to gain to accept a 50-50 chance of losing 100 praised, the answer is almost never 100 sis. It is, reliably, somewhere between $150 and $250. The gain has to be approximately twice the potential loss before people consider the gamble worth taking. Twice. Not slightly more, not marginally greater. Twice. This is the ratio, 2 to 1, losses to gains that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky found, replicated and embedded in the theory that would eventually win a Nobel Prize and quietly dismantle the foundational assumption on which modern finance had been built. But here's what the official story then did with that discovery. It filed it under cognitive bias. It labeled it a heuristic, a shortcut, a remnant of primitive cognition to be corrected through financial education and rational deliberation. It treated loss aversion the way the 18th century treated comets, as an anomaly to be catalogued, not a force to be understood. That is the mask, and underneath it is something considerably more interesting than a bias. The first crack appears when you look at where loss aversion is strongest. If loss aversion were simply a cognitive error, a remnant of irrational primitive thinking, you would expect it to weaken under conditions of high intelligence, high financial literacy, and extensive experience with probabilistic reasoning. You would expect traders, economists, and mathematically sophisticated investors to show less of it. The more rational the actor, the less the bias. The data shows the opposite. Professional traders exhibit loss aversion. Hedge fund managers exhibit loss aversion. Nobel laureates in economics exhibit loss aversion, and in some studies the bias is actually stronger in more financially sophisticated populations because financial sophistication, it turns out, does not rewire the amygdala. It simply gives the amygdala more sophisticated stories to tell about why the thing it doesn't want to do is in fact a bad idea for entirely rational reasons. The second crack appears in the neuroscience. In 2007, researchers at Stanford, led by Brian Knutson, placed subjects in an fMRI scanner and gave them a series of financial gambles. When participants were about to gain money, the nucleus accumbens lit up, the dopaminergic reward pathway, pleasure, approach behavior. When participants were about to lose money, a different region activated, the anterior insula, the same region that activates during physical pain, during social rejection, during visceral disgust. The brain does not process financial loss as the abstract opposite of financial gain. It processes it as damage. And damage, unlike opportunity, demands immediate response. The evolutionary logic is clear and merciless. A missed gain is unfortunate. A sustained loss is potentially fatal. In the environment in which the human nervous system was built, losing food, shelter, or social standing was not a recoverable setback. It was the beginning of a cascade toward death. The 2.1 asymmetry is not an error in the calculation. It is the calculation working precisely as designed, which raises a question that the official story never asks. If the mechanism works as designed, what is it designed for, and is that environment still the one we're living in? Let me tell you about a man I'll call David. David was not unsophisticated. He had a business degree. He understood, at least intellectually, what compound interest was. He had read the popular books. He had a brokerage account by the time he was 28 and a carefully considered portfolio by 30. He was, by any reasonable external measure, someone who had done the work. In the spring of a year he would rather not specify, David's portfolio contained two positions of roughly equal size. One had gained 40% over 18 months. The other had lost 30% over the same period. He needed to liquidate one position to fund a down payment on a property he had identified. He sold the winner. He held the loser. He sold the position that had gained 40%, locking in the gain, feeling the mild satisfaction of being right, walking away from the table with the chips. And he held the position that had lost 30%, telling himself it would recover, that selling now would make the loss real, that the company still had fundamentals, that patience was a virtue. The losing position lost another 40% before David eventually sold it at the bottom of a sector collapse. The property he had used the winning position to fund appreciated modestly. The mathematics of what he had done, the specific calculable cost of his 2 decisions in sequence ran to something approaching $70,000. When a financial therapist later walked David through what had happened, she gave it a name: the disposition effect, the systematic documented cross-cultural tendency of investors to sell winners too early and hold losers too long, a pattern so reliable that it has its own literature, its own research base, and its own body of institutional exploitation. David was not irrational, David was human. He was running the exact mechanism his nervous system was built to run. Selling the winner felt like taking something while it was still there. Holding the loser felt like refusing to admit the damage. Both behaviors were, from the perspective of the anterior insula, the correct response to imminent loss. From the perspective of his portfolio, they were catastrophic. David is not a case study. He is a category. In 2004, the behavioral economists Terence Odean and Brad Barber analyzed over 10,000 brokerage accounts over 7 years and found the disposition effect in virtually all of them. The effect was larger in more active traders. It was not diminished by experience. It was not diminished by financial education. It ran in every account, at every level of sophistication, with the quiet consistency of a biological process rather than a cognitive error, because that is precisely what it is. The disposition effect is merely the most visible manifestation of a pattern that runs through every domain of financial behavior. Consider the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing time, money, or effort into something that is failing, because the previous investment creates a perceived loss upon abandonment. Economists know it is irrational. Past costs are unrecoverable, regardless of future action, and decisions should be based only on future costs and benefits. But the anterior insula does not know this. It knows only that stopping feels like losing what was already spent, and losing what was already spent feels like physical damage, and physical damage must be prevented. So you stay in the bad relationship because of the years already invested. You continue the failing business because of the capital already committed. You finish the bad meal because you paid for it. You sit through the bad film because you bought the ticket. The sunk costs are gone. They were gone the moment they were spent. But the brain experiences their abandonment as a fresh loss, and the machinery that prevents fresh loss engages with its full force. Consider the endowment effect, the tendency to value things you own more highly than identical things you don't own. In a now famous experiment, Kahneman, Netsch and Thaler gave half of a group of subjects a coffee mug and asked them at what price they would sell it. They asked the other half, who had no mug, at what price they would buy the identical mug. The sellers demanded approximately twice what the buyers were willing to pay for the same object, in the same room, at the same moment. Ownership created loss aversion. The moment the mug became theirs, selling it became losing it, and losing it activated the mechanism. The mug had not become more valuable. Their relationship to the potential loss of the mug had changed. This pattern repeats across asset classes, financial products, real estate markets, labor negotiations, and international trade disputes with a consistency that cannot be accounted for by any model of rational preference. People demand more to give up what they have than they are willing to pay to acquire it. In every culture tested, at every income level tested, with objects of trivial value and objects of enormous value, the pattern is not a bias in the statistical sense, a random deviation from a correct mean that averages out across a population. It is a systematic, directional asymmetry that runs in the same direction in every person tested, in every culture studied, in every financial market analyzed. It is not noise, it is signal, and signal, in a financial market, is tradable. And now I need to tell you something that the behavioral economics literature spends considerable effort not saying clearly. Loss aversion is not a flaw in human cognition, it is a feature. It is the correct adaptation for the environment in which human beings spent approximately 99.9% of their evolutionary history. And the reason it causes such spectacular financial damage in the modern world is not because the mechanism is broken. It is because the mechanism is working perfectly in an environment it was never designed for. Consider the ancestral environment. You are on the Savanna. You have found a patch of berries. You can eat what is in front of you, or you can spend energy searching for a potentially larger patch somewhere over the next hill. The expected value calculation, if you could perform it, would look roughly like this: certain medium gain now versus probable large gain plus risk of finding nothing. For a creature with adequate caloric reserves, the rational choice might be to search. But for a creature operating near subsistence, which was the majority of human evolutionary history, the certain medium gain is not merely preferable. It is the difference between surviving until tomorrow and not surviving until tomorrow. The asymmetry in that calculation is not cognitive distortion. It is correct risk management under genuine resource scarcity. Now place that same mechanism inside a 21st century brokerage account. The certain medium gain is still more attractive than the probable large gain plus small risk of loss. The anterior insula is still treating the possible loss as physical damage. The machinery is still running exactly as designed, but the environment has changed in one critical way. The possible loss is no longer a threat to survival. A 30% portfolio decline does not kill you. A failed investment does not end your access to food and shelter. The stakes have collapsed by several orders of magnitude, but the mechanism, calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years for an environment where the stakes were existential, has not recalibrated. The 2-1 ratio is accurate for the Savanna. It is catastrophically miscalibrated for the stock market, and the gap between the environment that built the mechanism and the environment in which the mechanism now operates is the gap that behavioral finance exploits, that subscription services exploit, that casino designers exploit, and that every financial product built around anchoring, framing, and loss framing quietly and invisibly exploits every single day. The asymmetry is ancient, the exploitation of the asymmetry is modern, and the combination of the two is, I would argue, one of the most significant unexamined features of contemporary financial life. Which brings us to the question that the official story never asks. If institutions have known about loss aversion since at least 1979, since Kahneman and Tversky's publication of prospect theory, and if the mechanism is this reliable, this universal, and this predictable, then what exactly has been built on top of it in the 45 years since? The answer is considerably more organized than you might expect. The alternative interpretation of loss aversion, the one offered by evolutionary psychologists and behavioral ecologists rather than behavioral economists, is not that the mechanism is a bias to be corrected. It is that the mechanism is a profound intelligence operating at a timescale that our conscious deliberation cannot access. Consider, across every culture ever studied, from the Maasai to the Manhattan banker, loss aversion shows up at approximately the same ratio. The 2-to-1 asymmetry is not a product of Western capitalist culture. It is not a product of financial sophistication or its absence. It is not a product of age, education, gender, or income. It is universal in the way that color vision is universal, and breathing is universal, and the fear of falling is universal. Things that universal are not accidents of culture. They are structures of biology. And biological structures, particularly ones this consistent and this well preserved across evolutionary time, tend to be there for a reason. The reason in this case is something that mathematicians call the Kelly criterion, the optimal fraction of a resource to risk on any given bet. In environments of genuine resource scarcity and genuine survival pressure, the mathematically correct response to potential loss is precisely this level of conservatism. Not because loss is always worse than gain in some metaphysical sense, but because in the evolutionary environment, a run of losses was not recoverable in the way that a run of missed gains was. You could miss many opportunities and still survive. You could not sustain many catastrophic losses and still survive. Asymmetry of outcomes requires asymmetry of weighting. The mechanism, viewed this way, is not a bug. It is a solved problem, a solution that took hundreds of thousands of years to optimize, and that we are now applying inappropriately and at scale to an environment where the problem parameters have changed so radically that the solution has become the problem. Which means the question is not, how do we eliminate loss aversion? The mechanism cannot be eliminated. The question is, what would it mean to use it wisely? And what would it mean to notice when it is being used against you? The skeptic at this point has a reasonable objection. If loss aversion is this well documented, this widely taught, and this universally known among financial professionals, then surely the market should have arbitraged it away by now. Surely traders who understand the disposition effect should be able to exploit it, and in doing so correct it. Surely financial education should reduce its impact. Surely knowing about the bias should provide some protection against it. This objection sounds solid. It is the same objection that has been made in response to every finding in behavioral economics since 1979, and the data has, with extraordinary patience, answered it the same way every time. It doesn't work. Richard Thaler, who would later win the Nobel Prize for his work on behavioral economics, ran a series of experiments in the 1990s, specifically designed to test whether financial professionals who understood loss aversion showed less of it. They did not. Professional traders exhibited the disposition effect. Fund managers exhibited the endowment effect. Economists who had spent their careers studying irrational behavior exhibited exactly the irrational behavior they had spent their careers studying. The reason is architectural. Understanding loss aversion occurs in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of deliberate reasoning, conscious analysis, and voluntary choice. Loss aversion itself occurs in the anterior insula and the amygdala, regions that process threat, pain, and survival response, regions that fire before the prefrontal cortex has even entered the conversation. By the time you're aware of the decision, the emotional weighting has already been applied. The deliberate reasoning you bring to the decision is operating on premises that were set before you knew there was a decision to make. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a description of the terrain. You cannot think your way out of a process that completes before thinking begins. But you can design your environment differently. You can create systems that put distance between the trigger and the response. You can pre-commit to decisions before the anterior insula is activated. You can, in specific and limited ways, use the architecture of the mechanism rather than fighting the mechanism directly. What you cannot do is read a book about loss aversion and then stop experiencing loss aversion. The book tells you the name of the current. It does not stop the current. I want to show you something that is not in the behavioral economics textbooks. In 2015, a team of researchers at the University of Chicago analyzed the architectural design specifications for 14 major American casino developments built between 1990 and 2010. Not the gambling mathematics. The mathematics of house edge and probability are well documented and openly published. What they analyzed were the non-mathematical elements, the spatial design, the lighting transitions, the proximity of cash machines to gaming areas, the elimination of natural light and clocks, the placement of exit signs, and this is the element that did not make it into the press coverage, the systematic deployment of near-miss mechanisms. The near-miss. The moment when the slot machine shows 2 jackpot symbols and then a third one that is 1 notch off. The moment when the roulette ball circles the number you bet on and settles 1 number away. Mathematically, a near miss is identical to any other loss. The probability of the next spin is unchanged. The outcome is the same. You lost, but the anterior insula does not register a near miss as a loss. It registers it as an almost gain, and almost gains neurologically produce the same approach behavior as actual gains, the dopaminergic signal that says the resource is close, stay and pursue it, the environment is rewarding. The near miss is, in neurological terms, indistinguishable from winning. Casino designers know this. They have known it since at least the 1970s, when B.F. Skinner's variable ratio reinforcement schedules, the most addiction-producing reinforcement pattern ever discovered, operating on the same near-miss principle, were being explicitly applied to slot machine design. By the 1990s, the near-miss was engineered. The 2 jackpot symbols appearing on the first 2 reels were overrepresented in the stopping algorithms, not by accident, by design. The near-miss exploits loss aversion specifically. The almost loss of the almost gain creates more urgency than a clear loss because the anterior insula fires for the loss component while the nucleus accumbens fires for the almost gain component, and the combination produces a state of motivated urgency that is neurologically almost identical to the state produced by a genuine win. Now, step back from the casino and ask, where else is this structure deployed? The email that tells you your cart is about to expire. The real estate listing that tells you there are 2 other interested buyers. The job offer that sets an artificial deadline. The subscription that requires 3 steps to cancel and only 1 to renew. The loyalty points that are about to expire. The price that was $199 yesterday and is $149 today and will be $169 tomorrow. Every one of these is a loss framing mechanism. Every one of them is activating the anterior insula. Every one of them is engineering the near miss, and every one of them was built by someone who read the behavioral economics literature and understood, with great precision, that you are running a mechanism that cannot be turned off. The asymmetry was discovered by academics. It was commercialized by institutions, and the gap between those two facts is the gap in which approximately $500 billion in annual consumer spending occurs, spending that would not occur if the mechanism were not running, spending that institutions have spent 40 years learning to reliably produce. Here is the second thing the behavioral economics literature does not say clearly enough. The pain of financial loss is not a metaphor. In 2014, a team led by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA published a study examining the neural overlap between physical pain and social and financial loss. Using fMRI imaging, they found that the anterior cingulate cortex, the region most consistently associated with the subjective experience of physical pain, shows equivalent activation during financial loss as during moderate physical discomfort. The brain does not distinguish at the level of raw neural processing between the pain of a $5 loss and the pain of a mild burn. Eisenberger's earlier work had shown the same overlap between physical pain and social rejection, finding that the experience of exclusion activated the same neural circuitry as physical injury, leading her to coin the phrase social pain, and to argue that the experience of rejection is not merely analogous to physical pain, but is neurologically the same class of experience. The implications of this for financial decision-making are profound and almost entirely unexamined in popular discourse. When we say that losing money hurts, we are not speaking poetically, we are speaking anatomically. The hurt of a financial loss is processed in the same neural substrate as the hurt of a physical wound, and it produces the same cascade of responses: threat assessment, protective behavior, resource conservation, and critically, a heightened sensitivity to future threats. Pain sensitization, the well-documented phenomenon by which a nervous system that has experienced pain becomes more sensitive to subsequent stimuli in the same category. A person who has been injured responds more strongly to the threat of re-injury than a person who has not. A person who has experienced significant financial loss, whose anterior cingulate cortex has been activated at high intensity around the category of financial risk, becomes more loss-averse after the loss than before it. The loss does not simply cost what it costs. It recalibrates the instrument that assesses future costs. This is why the behavioral pattern David exhibited, holding the losing position rather than selling it, was not simply a cognitive error made in isolation. It was a pain avoidance behavior operating in a system that had been sensitized by previous financial pain to the specific stimulus of financial loss. The longer he held the position, the more accumulated pain the future sale represented. The more accumulated pain the future sale represented, the stronger the avoidance signal. The longer he held the position, the loss aversion produced more loss, which produced more loss aversion, which produced more loss aversion, which produced more loss. The mechanism designed to protect against loss was generating the conditions for loss to compound, which is, when you look at it clearly, one of the most elegant and devastating pieces of biological irony in the entire history of decision science. I can tell you exactly what the first comment war in this documentary looks like. Half of you are thinking, this is just an excuse for bad financial decisions. Plenty of people manage their money well. Stop giving people a reason to blame evolution for their poor choices. The other half are thinking, finally, someone is explaining why I did what I did with my portfolio in 2022, and I don't feel like a complete idiot. Both of those responses are running through the same mechanism we've been describing. The first response is protecting against the loss of a belief in personal agency, which feels to the anterior insula exactly like a $5 loss. The second response is accepting a new framework, which for some people feels like a gain, and for others feels like a different kind of loss. The loss of the simpler story in which the problem was fixable. Loss aversion runs in the comment section. It runs in the response to this documentary. It is running right now in your evaluation of whether what I'm telling you is something you want to be true. The escalation cycle of loss aversion has a technical name in the literature: loss chasing. In its most visible form, it is what the gambler does after a significant loss, increasing the size of subsequent bets, not because the probability has changed, but because the size of the previous loss has changed, the subjective magnitude of what winning would feel like. The loss has created a deficit that the mechanism registers as a wound, and the wound demands recovery. Increasing the bet is not irrational. From the perspective of the anterior insula, it is the fastest path back to the reference point. And the reference point, not the absolute level of wealth, is what the mechanism is actually protecting. Kahneman and Tversky were precise about this. Prospect theory does not describe people as trying to maximize absolute wealth. It describes people as trying to protect their position relative to a reference point, usually the current level of assets or the level they feel entitled to or the level they were promised. Gains and losses are not measured from zero, they are measured from wherever you were standing when the decision was made, which means if you were standing at $100,000 and you lost $30,000, you are not at $70,000 in the subjective financial landscape, you are at negative $30,000. The loss is experienced relative to the reference point, not relative to zero. And if the mechanism is protecting your position relative to the reference point, then the most rational feeling response to a significant loss is to take larger risks to recover the reference position, even if those larger risks have worse expected value than the smaller risks that would move you forward without recovering the loss. This is the escalation cycle. The loss creates pressure to recover. The pressure to recover creates risk-taking that exceeds what the situation rationally warrants. The excess risk-taking produces further losses. The further losses deepen the gap from the reference point. The deeper gap produces stronger pressure to recover, and so the cycle compounds. In the clinical literature on gambling disorder, the escalation cycle is the central mechanism. But it is not limited to gambling. It appears in failing businesses that continue to invest in strategies that are clearly not working, because the sunk costs and the gap from the original reference point create an unbearable pressure to recover that overwhelms the rational assessment of future prospects. It appears in real estate markets, where underwater mortgages create populations of homeowners who cannot sell, because selling would crystallize a loss relative to the purchase price, regardless of whether the purchase price was ever a rational reference point. It appears in careers, relationships, political positions, and national foreign policies. The mechanism does not know what kind of resource is being protected. It knows only that you had more, and now you have less, and the gap between those two states is experienced as damage, and damage must be recovered. The cycle is elegant in its brutality. The mechanism designed to prevent loss ensures, under conditions of sustained loss, that the loss grows. In October of 1987, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 22.6% in a single trading day, the largest single-day percentage decline in the history of the American stock market. Black Monday post hoc analyses of the trading patterns that day consistently show the same signature as prices fell, selling accelerated. Not because more investors independently decided to sell, but because each wave of selling activated the loss aversion mechanism in the next tier of investors, producing another wave of selling, which activated the mechanism in the next tier. The decline was not caused by any new information about the underlying value of the businesses whose stocks were falling. It was caused by the recursive activation of a biological mechanism that treats falling prices as escalating threat. The market fell because the mechanism that was supposed to protect investors from loss caused investors to behave in the way most likely to produce maximum loss. This is not a metaphor. This is the documented mechanism of every major market crash in recorded financial history. The mechanism that evolved to protect individual survival produces, at scale, collective financial catastrophe. The 2008 financial crisis has the same signature, operating at a longer time scale. The asset-backed securities market was sustained, past the point at which any rational analysis of the underlying mortgage quality could justify it, by the loss aversion of the institutions that held the paper. Selling would crystallize the loss. Not selling allowed the reference point to be maintained a little longer. And then all at once, when the crystallization could no longer be avoided, the loss aversion mechanism in every institution simultaneously converted from holding to selling, and the market collapsed in the precise pattern that a system of correlated loss aversion, triggered simultaneously, would produce. The 2-1 ratio was inside the bond market, inside the ratings agencies, inside the risk departments of the investment banks. The mechanism doesn't care about sophistication. It cares about the gap between where you are and where you were standing when the decision was made. And in 2008, everyone was standing somewhere considerably more comfortable than where they found themselves. Here is comment war number 2. So you're saying that market crashes are inevitable, that there's no such thing as rational financial policy, that we're just biological machines running programs we can't control. This is nihilism dressed up as science. And from the other direction, this explains everything. The whole system is rigged. There's no point in trying to invest rationally, because the institutions will always exploit this, and the market will always crash, and individual investors are just fodder. Both of those positions are loss aversion in a different register. The first is protecting the belief that rational control is possible, because losing that belief feels like, yes, a loss. The second is protecting against the loss of effort. Why invest in rational decision-making if the system defeats it? The actual answer is neither of those things. The mechanism can be partially managed. Individual outcomes can be improved by specific structural interventions, pre-commitment devices, automatic rebalancing, rules-based selling criteria established before a loss is experienced. The mechanism cannot be eliminated, but its effects can be contained. What cannot be done is to be unaffected. That is not one of the available options. Here is the paradox at the center of loss aversion, the one that takes a moment to see clearly. The people most afraid of loss are the most likely to cause it. Not through recklessness, through the opposite. Through the precise, careful, biologically motivated behaviors that the mechanism produces in response to the perception of threat. The investor who is most loss-averse holds losing positions too long and sells winning positions too early. The outcome: larger realized losses and smaller realized gains than a less loss-averse investor would achieve. The mechanism designed to prevent loss produces, at the individual level, an outcome indistinguishable from the outcome that would be produced by a mechanism designed to maximize it. The business owner who cannot bear to cut a failing product line, because cutting it would crystallize the sunk costs as losses, continues to allocate resources to the failure, while the profitable products starve. The company eventually fails more comprehensively than it would have if the failing product had been abandoned when it first showed signs of failure. The homeowner who cannot sell the house that has declined in value because selling would make the loss real, stays in a property that is continuing to decline, paying carrying costs that accumulate against a principal that is eroding, until the eventual forced sale is at a price significantly lower than the price available when they first decided not to sell. In every case, the behavior motivated by loss aversion produces outcomes that are worse than the outcomes that would have resulted from accepting the loss when the loss was small. The mechanism compounds the very thing it was designed to prevent. This is not a paradox in the logical sense. It follows directly from the architecture. But it is a paradox in the experiential sense, because the behaviors feel right. They feel prudent. They feel like the responsible refusal to panic, the disciplined maintenance of position, the rational decision to wait for recovery. They feel exactly like what a sensible person would do, because they are exactly what a sensible evolutionary mechanism would produce, in the wrong environment. In 1990, Kahneman, Netsch, and Thaler ran an experiment at Cornell University that is, in my view, one of the most revealing studies in the entire behavioral economics literature, not because of its complexity, it is a simple study, but because of what it reveals about the relationship between loss, aversion, and identity. The setup: subjects were given either a coffee mug or a bar of Swiss chocolate of roughly equivalent value. They were then given the opportunity to trade one for the other. Classical economic theory predicts that approximately half of the subjects, those who had been randomly assigned the item they would have preferred, should trade. The other half should keep what they have. The exchange rate should be roughly 50-50. The actual exchange rate, approximately 11%. Nearly 9 out of 10 subjects kept whatever they had been given, regardless of whether they would have chosen it. The endowment effect, loss aversion applied to ownership, had generated, within minutes of receiving a randomly assigned object, a strong preference to retain it over an objectively equivalent alternative. But here is the detail that the standard textbook presentation omits. In a follow-up condition of the same study, subjects were given the mugs, but told to think of themselves as agents, selling the mug on behalf of someone else rather than as owners. The endowment effect disappeared. When subjects did not identify the mug as theirs, when ownership was reframed as temporary stewardship, they valued it no more highly than the buyers valued it. The endowment effect is not about the object. It is about the self-concept attached to the object. It is not the mug that cannot be lost. It is the version of yourself that owns the mug. This finding has been replicated in financial contexts with disturbing consistency. Investors who frame their portfolios as permanent assets to be preserved, rather than as temporary stewardship of capital to be deployed optimally, show significantly higher loss aversion, significantly worse realized returns, and significantly more pronounced disposition effects than investors who use the agent framing. The loss that activates the mechanism is not simply a financial loss. It is a self-concept loss. What the anterior insula is protecting is not the $5. It is the version of yourself who has $5 more than you are about to have. I have been saving this for last. We have established that loss aversion is not a bias, but a feature. That it is neurologically identical to physical pain, that it runs in financial markets at scale, producing crashes, crises, and the systematic transfer of wealth from the loss-averse to the institutions that understand the mechanism, that it is not correctable through knowledge or sophistication, that it operates at the level of self-concept rather than merely at the level of money. And now I want to offer you the third twist, the one that requires all of that to have been said first. The $5 loss does not hurt more than the $5 gain feels good because of what the $5 represents financially. It hurts more because of what losing it says about who you are. Follow this carefully, because it is the deepest level of the mechanism and the one most consistently missed by both the behavioral economics literature and the financial self-help industry. In prospect theory, gains and losses are measured from a reference point. The reference point is usually assumed to be the current level of assets, but Kahneman himself noted, in footnotes that are rarely discussed in the popular presentations of his work, that the reference point is not necessarily the current level of assets. It can be the expected level of assets, the deserved level of assets, the level of assets that a person of your type, your background, your effort, your intelligence, your moral character would be expected to have. In other words, the reference point is identity. The reference point is the story you tell about who you are and what you deserve, and what the arc of your life is supposed to look like. A $5 loss is not measured against your current bank balance. It is measured against the version of yourself you are trying to protect, and that version of yourself carries, embedded within it, all the inherited beliefs about money and worth and entitlement that the previous documentary in this series examined, all the money scripts, all the intergenerational encoding, all the systematic architectural decisions that determined, before you were born, what reference point you would be navigating from. The $5 loss hurts more than the $5 gain feels good, not because of prospect theory in isolation. It hurts because the loss represents a departure from a narrative about who you are, and the narrative about who you are was not written by you, was not chosen by you, and in many cases was not written with your flourishing in mind. The mechanism that Kahneman and Tversky discovered, the 2-1 asymmetry, the anterior insular activation, the disposition effect, is not the deepest level of the architecture. It is the surface expression of something older and more fundamental, a sense of self that is measured in economic terms, that defines its integrity through the maintenance of a financial reference point, and that experiences any departure from that reference point, not as a financial event, but as a threat to the coherence of the self. You are not afraid of losing $5. You are afraid of being the kind of person who loses $5, and that fear, that specific ancient identity-level fear, is the most commercially exploitable thing about you. It is more exploitable than your hunger, more exploitable than your loneliness, more exploitable than your ambition, because it is attached to the machinery that is supposed to protect you from exploitation, and it fires with the same force, whether what is threatening you is a predator on the Savanna or a subscription renewal email. The asymmetry goes all the way down, and it doesn't stop at your bank balance. Comment War 3. Right on schedule. This is the most depressing thing I've ever watched. You're saying everything is rigged, loss aversion is identity, there's no escape, and the whole financial system is designed to exploit a mechanism you can't turn off. What exactly is the actionable takeaway here, and the counter-response which will generate its own subthread? Stop asking for takeaways. The inability to sit with understanding something without immediately needing to fix it is itself a form of loss aversion. You can't tolerate the loss of the belief that there's a solution. Both of those positions are correct, and the friction between them is exactly the space where the actual work happens, not in the resolution of the tension, but in the willingness to hold it. Here is what the research on loss aversion management actually shows, not the popular presentations. The research, the interventions that work do not work by reducing loss aversion. They work by changing the reference point, pre-commitment devices. The practice of deciding in advance, before a loss is experienced, what conditions will trigger a sell, a withdrawal, an exit, are effective. Not because they reduce the emotional response, but because they establish the reference point at a different location before the anterior insula is activated. You are not deciding to sell the losing stock when you are holding the losing stock and feeling the pain of the potential loss. You are deciding to sell the losing stock when you first buy it, establishing an exit rule at a moment when the self-concept is not yet attached to the position. The 401k automatic enrollment is the most successful financial behavior intervention of the last 30 years, not because it teaches people about loss aversion, but because it changes the reference point. When automatic enrollment is the default, not contributing is experienced as a loss relative to the new reference point. Loss aversion works in the direction of saving rather than against it. The mechanism is the same. The reference point has been moved. Reframing ownership as stewardship. The finding from the Kahneman, Netsch and Thaler agent study reduces the endowment effect by detaching the object from the self-concept. If the portfolio is not yours in the identity sense, if it is capital you are temporarily managing on behalf of your future self rather than an extension of your current self, the loss of it is less threatening. Not because the loss is smaller, but because the self that is being protected is located elsewhere. These interventions do not eliminate the mechanism, they redirect it. They use the architecture of loss aversion rather than fighting the architecture. They are in that sense a form of judo, using the force of the system to move in a direction that serves your purposes rather than someone else's. David, the man with the portfolio, the down payment, the $70,000 lesson, eventually did two things. He established written selling rules before opening any new position, and he began describing his portfolio not as his but as capital he was managing toward a specific future event. Both interventions were partial, both reduced the severity of the disposition effect in his subsequent trading, though neither eliminated it. He still felt the pull of holding losers. He simply had, now, a structural commitment that moved before the feeling could. The mechanism is still running in David. It will always be running in David. The question was never whether to eliminate it. The question was whether to be its subject, or in some limited and imperfect and always temporary sense, its observer. In 1738, a Swiss mathematician named Daniel Bernoulli published a paper in the Commentarii Academiae Scientiarum Imperialis Petropolitanae that should have ended the debate about rational economic behavior before it began. He was trying to resolve what was then called the St. Petersburg paradox, a lottery, with theoretically infinite expected value that virtually no one was willing to pay very much to enter. Bernoulli's solution was to propose that the utility of money is not linear but logarithmic, that each additional dollar is worth less to a person than the previous dollar, because the subjective experience of wealth diminishes at the margin. This is mathematically sound and empirically reasonable. It explains why the rich man gains less happiness from a windfall than the poor man gains from the same windfall. But Bernoulli's framework was symmetric. It described a concave utility function for gains, but it applied the same concavity to losses. The curve was the same shape on both sides of the origin. 241 years later, in 1979, Kahneman and Tversky showed that it was not. The curve is steeper on the loss side than on the gain side. The same concavity does not apply. The asymmetry is in the shape of the function itself. Losses are weighted more steeply than gains of equivalent magnitude, and the curve steepens as you move further from the reference point in the loss direction. This means, and Bernoulli, had he lived to see it, might have recognized this as the most important single correction to his framework, that the subjective experience of financial reality is not symmetric around zero. The emotional landscape of financial life is not a valley with equal slopes on both sides. It is a landscape with a gentle rise on the gain side and a cliff on the loss side. and we have been navigating that landscape with maps that show it as flat. Every financial model, every retirement planning tool, every investment algorithm that uses expected utility theory without Kahneman and Tversky's correction is drawing a flat map of a landscape that has a cliff. And the people using those maps, which is most people, in most financial decisions most of the time, are making decisions calibrated to a terrain that does not match the terrain they are actually walking. The map has been wrong for 241 years and 46 years respectively. One generation of economists inherited the wrong map. The next generation inherited the corrected map, but applied it only to individual bias research rather than to systemic financial design. And the generation after that built the algorithmic trading systems and financial product architectures that run today, using the corrected map as a resource for exploitation rather than as a resource for protection. Bernoulli was trying to describe how humans experience financial reality. Kahneman and Tversky were trying to correct the description. The financial services industry was trying to monetize the corrected description before the public understood it. All three projects are still running simultaneously. Only one of them has your interests at heart. I want to leave you with something that is not a resolution. The $5 loss will always hurt more than the $5 gain feels good. Not because you're irrational, not because you're weak, because you're built by a process that spent hundreds of thousands of years optimizing for survival in an environment where loss was frequently fatal and gain was frequently irrelevant to the question of whether you would be alive tomorrow. The mechanism is part of you. It is as much a part of you as the rhythm of your heartbeat or the involuntary blink when something moves toward your eye. It will fire. It fires right now in ways you cannot feel because you have no felt sense of the decisions being pre-weighted before you're aware of them. It fired when you decided whether to watch this documentary. It fires in how you're deciding right now what to do with what you've heard. And somewhere in institutions whose names you recognize, in product design meetings, you will never be invited to, in algorithmic models trained on the transaction data of 300 million people. Someone is using the precise knowledge of how and when and under what conditions it fires to ensure that it fires at moments convenient for purposes other than yours. This is not a conspiracy. It is a convergence of knowledge and incentive, and it has been building since 1979 with the patience of something that does not need to hurry, because the mechanism it is exploiting runs automatically and will continue to run automatically regardless of what any individual understands about it. What I cannot tell you is what to do with this. The pre-commitment devices are real and partially effective. The agent reframing is real and partially effective. The awareness that comes from understanding the mechanism is real and partially useful, in the way that knowing you are afraid is useful, not because it stops the fear, but because it changes your relationship to the fear. And changing your relationship to a thing that cannot be eliminated is the only form of mastery that actually exists. What I can tell you is this. The next time you feel the pull of a financial decision, the urgency of the expiring offer, the resistance to selling the losing position, the reluctance to cancel the subscription you no longer use, there is a question worth asking before you act. Is this a decision, or is this the mechanism? Because those are not the same thing. And the gap between them, the Viktor Frankl gap, the pause before the response, is the only territory in which you are actually making a choice, rather than executing a program written in your nervous system by an environment that no longer exists. The asymmetry is real, the exploitation is real, and the $5 loss will hurt. The only question is whether you notice it hurting before you act, or after. That gap, that single, ordinary, available to everyone pause is not a solution, but it is where the difference lives.
Velanthra, the veil over what is dark.